everyone, and welcome to episode 66 of the Medieval Podcast. I'm Danièle Cybulski, also known as the 5-Minute Medievalist. Before we get into today's awesome new interview, it's time to take a quick second to let you know about our special offer just for you from Skillshare, because personally, I love learning, and if you're here, I'm willing to bet that you do too. Skillshare has over 20,000 classes to take online, so you can keep yourself busy learning how to draw or write or be productive or just about anything else that you can think of. Classes are in the form of videos and Zoom workshops, and you can even join a group to help keep you learning and motivated. That is pretty awesome already, but check this out. Friends of the Medieval Podcast can try Skillshare out for free for 2 whole months. Just visit medievalist.net/Skillshare and let the learning begin. And speaking of learning, it's time to learn more. No matter what time and place we like to spend our time studying and focusing on, there's always a wide world of interesting things going on at the very same time. Learning more about where cultures mix and collide is one of the best ways to expand our view of our own time and place or specialty, but sometimes it's hard to know where to begin to zoom out. Enter Dr. Valerie Hansen. Valerie is the Stanley Woodward Professor of History at Yale University and the author of The Year 1000, When Explorers Connected the World and Globalization Began. Also the author of The Silk Road, A New History, and The Open Empire, A History of China to 1600, Valerie has zoomed out from her usual work on China in her new book to give readers a global perspective on what's going on in the year 1000, stretching all the way from Newfoundland to the Yucatan Peninsula to Mali to Japan. So fasten your seatbelts because today we're going on a world tour. Here's Valerie Hansen on how cultures were connecting in the year 1000, what goods people were trading, and just how far the trade routes went. Well, thank you, Valerie, for joining me to talk about the year 1000. It's a pleasure to meet you.
Oh, Danièle, thank you so much for inviting me.
It's such an interesting book, and I really think other people should have a look at it. So let's jump right in. So this book is called The Year 1000, When Explorers Connected the World and Globalization Began. So I think that there's a couple things we need to kind of figure out first. What do you mean by globalization in terms of this book?
When I say globalization, and it's when globalization began, so I'm not arguing that globalization reached its full thrust in the year 1000, but it began in the sense that world's regions for the first time connect with each other. This is in terms of trade goods, but also ideas and also the movement of people. One of the large-scale migrations that's taking place is the slave trade that affects, well, we know about Afro-Eurasia, so it affects people in Africa and North and Eastern Europe and Central Asia. It's probably going on in the Americas too. I think the slave trade is happening everywhere. For me, the bottom line with globalization is when people living in one region in the world are affected by forces in another region in the world over which they have no control. And that's something we can see most clearly in East and Southeast Asia, because China then, as now, was a huge manufacturing power and was importing a lot of aromatic woods and spices from Southeast Asia. And so producers in Southeast Asia are collecting these for a Chinese market that they have no knowledge of and no experience of, I should say. The people who are doing the selling have some knowledge of it. And by the same token, people in China are producing manufactured goods like ceramics and metal pots, textiles, and the same thing, that they're exporting them in large quantities to places that they don't know. And one of the things that I write about in the book is that there's people don't say anti-globalization riots, but there are anti-expat merchant riots. Very early on, one of them happens in 995 in Cairo, and it's the Cairenes are objecting to the presence of merchants from Amalfi in Italy, and who they blame for the burning down of some ships in the Navy.
So is this kind of anti-globalization or anti-merchant feeling one of the reasons why you picked the year 1000 to go with for this book?
No, to be honest, I didn't find out about the anti-globalization movements for a long time into the research. I picked one. That would be great. That would be a good reason to pick 1000. I picked 1000. I started with a hunch that regions were expanding in different parts of the world, and I could see that. I'm a Chinese historian by training. I could see that most clearly in China. So regions were expanding, and then I think that the year 1000 is really because the Vikings crossed the Atlantic in the year 1000. And so that is a datable event. I mean, it's as close to 1000 as we can get to. And then when they cross the North Atlantic, that connects the Americas with Afro-Eurasia. And so that's the rationale for the year 1000. But as I was doing all the research, I just found out about more and more connections among different regions that all seem to be around the year 1000. So, and a lot of them have archaeological evidence. So in the Americas, we have evidence that the Maya are trading chocolate with the peoples of Chaco Canyon in modern New Mexico. And the dating is exactly the same. It's 1000. And so something is going on around the world. And that's what interested me. That's synchronicity. And that's what I ended up writing about.
And I think that's really interesting because one of the points that you made was that around the year 1000, we're starting to connect continents in ways that maybe haven't happened as much before. But it's not because of a new technology. It's just more exploration than before. So how does that work for you?
No, you said you're absolutely right. I don't think there's any new technology. I do think that we know there's an increase in agriculture. Well, I mean, we have agricultural output increasing in Western Europe, in West Asia, the Islamic world, also in East Asia, also in the Maya heartland. There's, I think, a very strong likelihood this has something to do with climate, but I'm not a climate historian, and I would say the research is still not definite. We're certain in Europe that the medieval warming period is starting, but we're not as sure in the rest of the world what's going on with the climate. And sometimes the climate could be warming, but there could be more rain or less rain, and those things can affect agriculture. But we know for sure that agricultural output around the world is increasing, and that frees people from having to work the land and allows them to go to other places. And I think that's part of what's going on. I also think war bands, there's a lot of, in Western Europe and among the Vikings, we always talk about war bands, but there's similar structures in other places where usually men, sometimes women, but almost always men, have been part of a larger entourage, and they want to break apart and set up their own show somewhere, and they need to leave where they are and go someplace new.
Yeah, because everyone's taken over the land that already exists, that
Right,
they've
the
been
land that
using.
exists is full. So
Yeah.
they need to go someplace else.
Yeah, and you said that the population at this time is millions, millions. I don't remember the exact number you said. It was like 250 million. Is that too high?
Exactly. You do remember. You do remember. That's exactly right.
Okay. Good.
For the world. I mean, and that's approximate, right? We have no census, but somewhere around 250, 300 million people around the whole world. And that, I think, is a kind of a tipping point where it's not that the world is getting full, but that the spaces between different regions in the peripheries are starting to fill up with people. And people are noticing and having contact with their neighbors for the first time.
Yeah. Yeah. And you've organized the book kind of going from westernmost to easternmost. And one of the things you talk about, I think that on the podcast, people have heard a lot about Viking and stuff, but we haven't really heard a lot about the trade routes that are happening in the indigenous areas, North America. So one of the things I thought was really interesting in the book is that you mentioned that the Vikings have come over. We have really solid evidence that they were in Newfoundland, but there is some evidence that they might have gone as far south as Mexico. So what gives you that impression that it's possible they might have even accidentally ended up in Mexico?
Right. Well, there are some murals. The largest city in the Americas in the year 1000 is Chichen Itza, which is on the northern edge of the Yucatan Peninsula. And it has, I think a lot of people have been there. It's very famous for the effects during it's not the solstice. What's the opposite? Every 3 months. Well, maybe the solstice. Anyway, the effects of the sun on some of the buildings at Chichen Itza, and it's on a lot of people's bucket list. But there's a building at Chichen Itza called the Temple of the Warriors, and it had some murals showing people with light blonde hair and light eyes, and they're shown in a battle. They're captives, and their arms are tied behind their backs. And I write in the book about the possibility that those were Norse, that they were Norse captives. We haven't found anything comparable to what archaeologists have found at Lansall Meadows, at that site in Newfoundland, where we can be rock solid sure that the Norse were in Lansall Meadows. In the Yucatan, we don't have that kind of archaeological evidence. The site hasn't been excavated with the same care as Lansall Meadows, and who knows, we may still find something. But the timing is perfect. Chichen Itza peaked around the year 1000. That's when this temple was built. And Vikings, we know from the Icelandic sagas that they were blown off course. And so, were they blown all the way to the Yucatan Peninsula? We don't know. But these murals are very suggestive.
Yeah, and that's very cool because, well, you outline it all in the book, but there's nothing comparable to kind of the ships that they've drawn or the people that they've drawn. Nothing comparable to that elsewhere in that area of the world. And one of the things I think people might not realize is that there is a huge trade network in North and Central America, going as far south as Peru to the northern United States. So what's being traded back and forth in North America and Central America at this time?
I mean, in any given leg of the journey, there are different commodities. So I mentioned the chocolate going between, and Chichen Itza it's a city of about 40,000 people. So that's bigger than Paris and London in the year 1000, and much, much smaller than Cordoba, and much smaller than Baghdad or the Song dynasty capitals of Kaifeng and later Hangzhou. But in terms of the trade goods that are moving, things are going in and out of Chichen Itza. The connections with Chichen Itza to the south are a lot of metal goods. So gold comes into the Maya world for the first time, actually not in 1000, about 900. That's so. But it's still, it would be, I mean, in a perfect world, everything would happen exactly in the year 1000. I think historians, 100 years is pretty good. I'm not going to object to that. Oh, and actually, I think 100 years is pretty good. Cahokia Mounds is a key site in the central U.S., modern U.S., outside of East St. Louis. And Cahokia, like Chichen Itza, is a central node. So there are shells from California. There is copper from the Great Lake regions. There's a trade in chert, in different kinds of flint that you use to start fires. And these are all the things that survive archaeologically. So there may have been trade in other things that don't survive. But we can be pretty confident that these were trade routes because a certain good, we know for sure, a certain kind of chert originates in one place. If you find it 1,000 miles south, you're like, okay, it traveled from that place. We can be positive it came overland. And so the trade between Chichen Itza and Chaco Canyon is interesting because we know the two-way trade. We've got the chocolate going north. We have macaw birds going north, and they have very brightly colored feathers. Archaeologists have actually found caged macaws. And I love what the archaeology tells us that we didn't used to be able to know. But, I mean, this is very sad. The birds are traded to the north in cages, and then their bones show that they didn't get outside. So the peoples of Chaco Canyon wanted the feathers, but they didn't take very good care of the birds, right? They kept them inside. So, and then in the opposite direction, we have turquoise. And so we have turquoise used in Mayan art for the first time. Again, this year 900 is when we start to see these changes.
Yeah.
So, but the thing is, there's a huge trade network all over the Americas.
Yeah. And as you're saying, a lot of the evidence for the trade network in the Americas, it has to be archaeological because written records don't exist or they are very, very rare in the Americas. And one of the ways, I'm going to move us east a little bit, one of the ways that you find out a lot about Africa around this time is from textual sources, but they're not from textual sources within Africa. So what did you have to dig up to learn about Africa around the year 1000?
So, it's funny. You're right. Most of the accounts we have are in Arabic, and they're written by people outside of Africa. And one of our most important sources for West Africa in the year 1000 is by someone who lives in Spain named al-Bakri. But we have writing in Africa. We have some inscriptions that are from West Mali, and they're from like 1010. So they're right on the same date that everything keeps coinciding with. And we also have some archaeology. And so, like al-Bakri talks about bald dinars. Dinars are the coins that people are using, and a bald dinar is a coin that doesn't have a ruler's face stamped on it. That's waiting for a ruler to buy that coin and then impress it with his visage. And archaeologists have found those. So there's a lot of, not a perfect correspondence between everything al-Bakri tells us about or the other Arabic. They're not, I should say, they're writing in Arabic, these observers of what's going on in Africa. But there's a good fit archaeologically. And we can see there's a giant city, a settlement called Geno, about 20,000 people. And we can see the arrival of Islam in that because there's great stratigraphy of pits that are maybe, I'm just thinking of very, very deep, maybe 10, 20 meters deep. I know that's not very specific, but there's a place in the stratigraphy where they have found tiles that have Arabic on them. Beneath, there's plenty of material. So this was a big settlement before the Arabs arrived. But we can see at that moment that they arrive, and people are already building houses that have charms to protect them that quote the Quran.
Yeah, I certainly don't mean to say that there was no civilization in Africa before this.
Yeah.
Nobody was writing. But we do have a lot of Arabic sources that are telling us about Africa at that time, which I think is really interesting. So, what other stuff is found in Africa that tells us about the communities that were established there? There's one city, as you say in the book, where usually you have people who are traveling, they migrate for agricultural reasons, but they don't really have cities often if their culture is based around this migration. But there's one city that fills up every year and it ends up having something like 20,000 people in it. Can you
Right.
tell us about that place?
Right. That's Gene Geno,
Right.
and it fills up very logically during the rainy season. People come in and they stay put. And then it seems likely that when it's not the rainy season, they go back to the places surrounding the city and not excavate and cultivate cultivate their crops. And I think I was going to say one of the things that you can see this in the literature of people writing about Africa in the last 20 years, and that I tried to do my best with, was that Africa is not just providing gold and slaves for the rest of the world. It's importing goods. The things that we know about, again, this is the archaeology. So it's importing a lot of beads, and there are very elaborate bronzes that have beads, tiny little beads that like we would sew on a dress, those kinds of beads, lots and lots of beads that have been pressed into the bronze. And those are coming in. Also, shells are coming in. And so we know there's some archaeological excavations of shells coming from the Maldives, from India. So Africa is a consumer. It's not just an exporter. And that was something that I really wanted to show in my discussion of Africa.
Yeah, that's so important because I think that is kind of an imperialist view, that we're looking from here and we're looking back on several centuries of history where people are saying we are taking from Africa. But if we look at Africa, by itself, the cultures that are there, it's a totally complex whole bunch of countries and civilizations and that kind of stuff. So I really appreciate that you're not just making it. You're not just falling into that default, but looking at it critically and seeing how it's both importing and exporting. I think that's super important. And I really appreciate that part of the book.
Good,
Yeah.
good.
Yeah. So some of the places on the eastern part of Africa, they're connected to trade routes that go all the way to China. And China's your specialty. So maybe we should start going further east and talking about China, which is not unified at all moments during the Middle Ages. So tell us a little bit about China and how it was structured around the year 1000.
In the year 1000, there are two powers in China, but actually, when I was in college, we called China proper, which we've stopped saying now. The implication is that there was an improper China and a proper China.
Yeah,
So
right.
now we call it the 18 provinces. That's not so great because if you don't know anything about China, you don't know that there are these, but it's kind of the main parts of China. So I would say the Yellow River Valley, the Yangtze River Valley, the Pearl River Valley, the parts of China in the People's Republic today that are occupied by Han populations. And those areas are under the rule of one dynasty called the Song dynasty. And then to their north is another dynasty that a lot of people haven't heard of. A lot of Chinese historians don't even know about it, called the Liao. And it has 5 capitals. It's a nomadic people. The rulers of the Liao are called the Khitan. And the royal family is from a tribe called the Khitan. The Khitan are nomads. And the rulers have 5 capitals. They move around during the year. They're big hunters. And so they go where the hunting is good. And they establish a capital in the south where the hunting is a little bit earlier than it is farther north. That's what draws them there. And that capital becomes later the city of Beijing. So if you think of China, it basically most of China is under Song rule, and then just the northern edge of it is under the Liao dynasty rule, and then the Liao govern all the grasslands to the north, and including like Mongolia, and some of Siberia. And so in terms of connections to other people, the Song have deep maritime connections, and there's a trade route in use from the southeast coast of China from two cities called Quanzhou and Guangzhou. Guangzhou, a lot of people with an old-fashioned education may know it as Canton. Guangzhou, nay Canton. And those were major ports. And then the ships leaving there went around Singapore, around the Straits of Malacca and Southeast Asia to South Asia, from there to what's modern Iraq, the ports of modern Iraq, and then down to East Africa. And that shipping route is something that really interested me. It's a major shipping route. If you take the distances all the way from China to the southernmost place that the ships went on the East African coast, it's 3 times longer than where Columbus traveled when he crossed the Atlantic. So it's a very long route. And archaeologically, we have evidence of Chinese ceramics being traded along that entire route. There's a lot of trade there. And I think, I don't know, because I've been studying China for a long time, but I think when we think about Columbus, we're maybe thinking that's the first person to go that far between 2 continents. I think that may be what sort of popular ideas about Columbus. And something that really interests me is that, yes, he's traveling on a new route in the mid-Atlantic, but the Vikings were in the North Atlantic 500 years earlier. And there are other routes in the world that are much longer than where Columbus went that other people have been using since the year 1000. So, Columbus does something new and his voyages have huge impact. And I always think it's important to say he didn't deliberately carry germs from Europe to the Americas. He didn't know that there were going to be mass deaths in the Americas. But that route in itself was not particularly long. That wasn't the innovation. There were other routes that were much longer that were in regular use.
Yeah. And what you say when you talk about the Americas, which I think is a really important point, is that the Europeans were able to conquer a lot of the peoples in North America, Central America, because those connections between cultures already existed. So if there wasn't so much trade and connection, it probably wouldn't have been as easy for them to conquer, because those things were already established. But I want to leave the Americas for a bit and talk about how established this trade route was, as you say, between China and the Middle East and Africa. And I just want to kind of reemphasize that this is a very well established and busy trade route, that it's not just like somebody's just doing a maiden voyage. And there's a lot of things that they're trading. I do think it's important to come back to the slave trade. So let's come back to that, because I think that one of the things you mentioned too is that most of the cultures in the world at this time have a slave trade. So it's very important when you're studying this moment in history to understand it. So what do you think people should know about the slave trade around 1000?
It's huge. I mean, I think that the slave trade, the transatlantic slave trade, is also huge. And the numbers are very hard. They're easier to get for the Atlantic crossing because many ships have manifolds and you can know how many people were on board. That's not true of caravans crossing the Sahara. We just don't have comparable records. But the historians who've crunched the numbers have ended up thinking that as many people crossed the Sahara, or nearly as many people crossed the Sahara, like just short of 12 million, between about 600 and 1600. And that's first phase of the slave trade, as crossed the Atlantic in the next phase, which was shorter, about 400 years. So 12.5 million is the currently accepted figure for the transatlantic slave trade. People don't, I think, realize that slaves we're talking about a world, as we said, there's no technological breakthrough in the year 1000 that explains these connections. And different places have different goods that they can export. And poor places, often, if they don't have certain mineral goods or animal furs, are a very common commodity traded around the world. If they don't have those things, slaves is one of the things that is a commodity and sometimes it's people they've captured, but sometimes it's their own people. And we have textual descriptions of the Rus. These are the people who they come into what's Ukraine, but they're coming in from Scandinavia. And we have observers saying they will sell their countrymen. So it's not just captives. It's a calculated decision that a person can be a commodity. I think something people probably don't know much about, I certainly didn't before I started working on this book, is so much of the slave trade was sending slaves into the Islamic world. And that was because in the Islamic world, a lot of the slaves were women. A man would typically have a wife, and he might have a single wife, but he might have additional wives in Islam, right? He's allowed to have four main wives. He may have more. But if he fathered a child with a slave woman, the children were free from the get go. And he was encouraged, all of the teachings encouraged him to free the mother of his free children. If he didn't, when he died, she was freed. So it's this constant, in a way, well, I shouldn't say anything is good about slavery, but nothing is good about slavery.
No,
Right?
no, I think we understand that.
Right. But what's interesting about this, the way slavery was practiced in the Islamic world, was that the slaves could attain their freedom, or their children could be born into freedom. And so there's a lot of mixing in different societies, and there's some social mobility. I mean, that's a funny word, but we even have examples of Abbasid caliphs, of the rulers of the entire Islamic realm, who marry slave women, who then rise to become very powerful rulers, or their sons rise to become very powerful rulers. And so I think when we think about the slave trade, most of us, I think, know about the transatlantic slave trade, but we should know that there was an earlier chapter, also deeply significant, affecting many, many people throughout Africa and Eurasia, focused on these big cities in the Islamic world like Baghdad and Cairo.
Yeah. And I think you're making some hugely important points here, because I think because of the legacy of the transatlantic slave trade, people think that the only slaves, might be coming from Africa. And I really think that it's important to note that people are enslaving their own people from all continents on earth at this time. And it does create a huge mix of cultures. Again, people think of medieval Europe as being a very white place, but there's a huge diversity of people, in part because of the slave trade. And again, it's not to say that it's a good thing, but it is something that is noteworthy, that there is a mix of cultures and peoples and races all over the place. So I think that your examination of the slave trade here, and you do get at it in pretty much every chapter, is very informative of what's going on in the year 1000. Now, there's one thing that comes up a few times that surprised me, and that is the idea of red cloth becoming important when cultures are meeting. So tell us about a couple instances where red cloth is important, because that surprised me.
Well, I guess red cloth, we live in a world now where we have textiles of all different colors, right? And we just take them for granted. But if you lived in a society where most of the dyes were herbal, right? But maybe all the dyes were herbal. Red, I think, could be very unusual. And the best example, I think, of the appeal of red cloth is back to the Americas, is the Norse arrive, and this is in Vinland, which we're not absolutely sure where Vinland was, but somewhere, I think, between Maine and Newfoundland, somewhere in there. Chaleur Bay, there's some very thoughtful people who put their money on Chaleur Bay. And the Norse, and this happened, I think, with lots and lots of encounters, that people met each other, and everyone is traveling light because they have to carry everything, or maybe the Norse are traveling in boats, but once they're off the boats and they're walking, they're traveling very light. And when people met each other, I think they just looked to see what the other person had, right? What did they have that we don't have? What's cool, right? What's interesting? And the Norse had this red cloth, and the Native Canadians, the First Nations, are so pleased, so excited about that red cloth, that they start trading furs for the red cloth. And then the red cloth starts to run out, and the Norse start trading smaller and smaller snippets. The Icelandic sagas say as wide as a finger's breadth, a finger's width. And the indigenous peoples are still trading the same amount of fur. So that's one place where the red cloth is very important, and we can see the appeal. Now, you say I'm sorry, I'm blanking. There are other places. You recall other places. You can
Hang
jog.
on. I put a note. Yeah, so it says there's an early Arabic source that reports that slaves sold at Zuila, I don't know if I'm saying that right, were bought for short pieces of red cloth. So this is being part of the
I was thinking about
trade.
When you said red cloth, I was thinking about something. It's not in the book. It's from my earlier work on the Silk Road, but there's a trade. It's actually around the year 1000, but we have a record of a peddler who is going. He's not a peddler. He's a putting out agent. He's bringing cloth to people who are going to work the cloth, and then he's going to go pick it up after they've worked it. He's giving them white cloth, and then when he comes back, he picks up the red cloth. And so he's trading I think 3 pieces of white cloth for 2 pieces of red. So the red dye again makes the cloth much more valuable.
Yeah.
So, I mean, we're talking about people living. I mean, if you look at I was going to say, living very austere lives. If you look at if you go to the museum at Lansaw Meadows, there's nothing very fancy there. One of the artifacts that convinced people that it was a Norse settlement is a bronze pin. And, yes, it's an attractive pin, but it's a very simple, just like a straight, almost like a needle with a ring at the end of it. Right. And so this is a world where people are just have the necessities. Right. Oh, I was going to say, I was talking about my book with one of my colleagues named Paul Friedman, who works on spices in medieval Europe, and he would be a great guest for you. He's an
You're
fun
right. You're right.
and I was saying to him, in China, we haven't talked about this very much, but one of the things that's happening in China in the year 1000 is that the whole society, not just the wealthy, are consumed with changing the way the air smells, changing the way food tastes, changing the way drinks taste, and everything they're doing to change these tastes, these flavors in the air, all of those elements are coming from our woods and fragrances and spices coming from Southeast Asia. So anyway, I was talking to Paul Friedman and I said, I don't understand this. We have a record at a Chinese market of people buying chunks of sugarcane, which is still, now you don't see it in Chinese cities, but when I was first started going to China in the 80s, you could go to a market and see chunks of sugarcane. In a rural market, you'll still see chunks of sugarcane, and people just hack it off and chew it. I'm sure it's terrible for your teeth, right? But it's very sweet. And I don't understand, why can't they just eat sugarcane? Why do they have to infuse it with musk? Musk is this. It comes from a special kind of deer in the Tibetan plateau. It's like near where they produce sperm. It produces, and it turns out to be something that is a fixative for perfume. It makes perfume last longer and stay stronger. So in the Sung China, people were infusing sugarcane with musk. They're also infusing it with aloes wood, which is one of these fragrant woods from Southeast Asia that we are not familiar with in America. It's also called eaglewood. It has many, many names in English, none of them you've ever heard of. And it was a very popular commodity in the year 1000 in China. So peasants are going to the market and they're buying sugarcane that's infused with these flavors. And I'm saying to Paul Friedman, I don't get it. Why don't they just have sugarcane? Why do they have to infuse it with musk or with aloes wood? And Paul says, Valerie, you don't understand anything about luxury. This is exactly the same as Starbucks. You go into Starbucks and you pay 30 cents and you get an infusion of pumpkin into your coffee. Right? And it means you're having a special day.
Yeah.
You have enough money to have your coffee taste like pumpkin and or some other flavor. And that human impulse to vary the kind of day you're having by eating a strange flavor, that's something that I love. That's like a constant from the year 1000 to now.
Yeah. And then telling everybody about it, that your favorite flavor is an infusion of this.
Right. Exactly. Right. But you don't have to have that much money. You can just go to the market and get this sugar cane. And some guy who's selling sugar cane has figured out people will pay a little bit more if it tastes of musk or it tastes of aloes wood. Okay, good investment. So, and people in China, so they're doing stuff like that. They're also taking all kinds of medicines. Medicines are one of the things that people, I think, are very open to new medicine if they think it'll help with whatever problem. There's so many kinds of sources we have for China that we don't have for other parts of the world, but we have ingredients for medicines. So we can see that people were putting these imported elements from Southeast Asia in their medicine. We have ingredients lists for incense. Incense, guys, the same thing. The huge increase in these materials coming in from Southeast Asia.
Yeah, I thought that was really cool. You've cited that there is something called like Mr. Chen's Guide to Incense, which I just think is the best title I've ever heard. It just sounds like such a sweet book.
There's no copyright.
Oh, well, I need to look at it. But I think it's important, as you say, that this globalization, this intercontinental trade has to do with things like luxury and health. So it's not just the things that you need, but also the things that you like and that you want too.
Right. Right.
Well, I want to thank you for coming on the podcast to talk about this because it's a very interesting book and I think other people should read it. And it's just been a great conversation. Thank you so much.
I enjoyed talking to you, Danielle. You're a very close reader. I appreciate your enthusiasm. I appreciate the reminder about the red cloth, the second example.
It's my pleasure.
All right, bye. Take care.
Bye. To find out more about Valerie's work, you can visit her website at valerie-hansen.com. That's Valerie-Hansen.com. Her new book is The Year 1000, When Explorers Connected the World and Globalization Began, and you can find it in all major bookstores. Before we go, here's Peter from medievalist.net to tell us what's on the website. What's going on, Peter?
Hey. Well, this week on the site, we started a little look at the Penguin Classics. You probably know these like ancient medieval texts that have been translated, and there's like dozens and dozens of them you can find at the like used bookstore. So this week we did like a piece about 10 of the more famous ones of this collection that deal with the Middle Ages. And next week we're going to give you 10 like lesser known gems. So we have that on the website, and plus you can read pieces about fatness and thinness in the Middle Ages and medieval movies set in North America. So some summer viewing if you want.
That sounds good. I love the Penguin Classics. They're always so good, and they're such good paperbacks that you feel like you can just throw them in a bag and beat them up, and they look better as they get beat up. I love those ones.
Yeah. Like they have to have the nice little cracks in the spine and stuff like that. That shows you really love them. So.
Yeah, I have a lot of well-loved ones on the shelf, and I know you do too.
Yeah, they're all off. They're good things, and like crucially, they kind of started out as let's be able to produce like cheap kind of paperbacks for like the average person to read, and it became a hit right away. And it's almost like 75 years old. Wow. This collection, so.
Wow. I mean, that's not old in medieval terms, but it's old for paperback terms.
Yeah.
I'm going to check that out and see what there is, the 10 interesting ones you're talking about. And then I'll have to tune in and see which ones are lesser known.
Please do.
I will. All right. Thanks, Peter.
Thanks.
Thank you to everyone on patreon.com for all your support. If you're new to the podcast and you're enjoying it, please take a minute to check out our Patreon page where you can find sweet deals on Medieval Warfare Magazine, the Medieval Magazine, and our own special book club. You can also choose to access an ad-free version of medievalist.net, or you can just kick in $1. It's your support that makes this podcast possible, so thank you. I appreciate every single bit. You can find all the action at patreon.com/medievalists. To find out more about the whole medieval world, including a new regular feature on medieval China, follow medievalist.net on Facebook or Twitter at medievalists. You can find me, Danièle Sobalski, across social media at 5MIN Medievalist. And you can find my books, including Life in Medieval Europe, Fact and Fiction, at all your favorite online or reopening bookstores. Our music is Beyond the Warriors by Guy Frog. Thanks for listening and for connecting with me across the world.